It is Monday, April 8th, 2019. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Joining me today at the Russell Library here in Athens is Mr. Chris Carr. Mr. Carr is Georgia's 54th Attorney General, appointed by Governor Nathan Deal. He was sworn in on November 1st, 2016, and was elected to that post last November. In that capacity, he also sits on the executive committees of both the National Association of Attorneys General and the Republican Attorneys General Association. Prior to becoming AG, Mr. Carr served as Commissioner of the Georgia Department of Economic Development from 2013 to 2016, and he was Senator Johnny Isakson's Chief of Staff from 2007 until 2013. Before that, he managed Senator Isakson's successful election to that office. And last but not least, he is also a former member and past chairman of the Richard B. Russell Foundation. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk history and politics with us.
Thank you, Ashton. I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Well, it is great to have you. And I was wondering if the first thing we could talk about is just a little bit about your childhood and your upbringing.
Sure. Well, I was actually born in Lansing, Michigan in 1972. And in fact, interestingly enough, I was once on a plane coming back from Washington with Congressman Tom Price, and lo and behold, we were born at the same hospital.
A fellow Michigander.
A fellow Michigander at Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, Michigan. But so my family's from there. My parents were from there. Mom from Jackson, Michigan, and my dad from Grand Rapids. And then in 1978, we moved to Georgia because my dad was actually in the van business. He had a manufacturer's rep company, and so he put anything inside of a van that would go in a van. The seats and the carpet, and back then it was a pretty big deal. You know, there was a lot of accessories for a van, and
shag carpet was a thing.
The blinds and the whole, seats and steering wheels and all that sort of thing. Well, the industry was based down here, and so he basically covered the entire southeast, and so we moved to Dunwoody, and when I was in kindergarten, halfway through kindergarten, and so I grew up in Dunwoody. I went to Shallowford Elementary School, which unfortunately is no longer there, but in DeKalb County. And then went to Marist in Atlanta, graduated in 1990. I'm a double dog. Graduated in winter quarter, when we had quarters, winter quarter 95 with a BBA in international business, and then worked briefly for Georgia Pacific before I came back to law school. Graduated in 99 with my JD. So that's that gets us at least to...
Right. I read somewhere that you told, I think this was a National Journal article that said you cried when you found out that Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford in 1976. Is that true?
Well, that's what my mom says, so
Okay.
we're going to go with it. But so we were living in Lansing in 1976, and of course Ford was from Michigan. And
right.
My family was Republican, and my mom says that I did. I came downstairs and the morning after the election and asked her who won, and she said Jimmy Carter. And apparently I just burst into tears, and she says she knew at that point going forward I was going to be involved in politics. The only other and I've always loved politics, but the only other political kind of memory that I have was in the third grade. So we'd moved to Georgia in 78. So third grade was the 1980 election.
Okay.
And it was Jimmy Carter from Georgia and Ronald Reagan. Well, everybody in my third grade class wanted to be Jimmy Carter for a debate. Sure. But I raised my hand and I said I'd be Ronald Reagan. And so that was it. None of all the kids thought that was kind of odd because Ronald Reagan wasn't a Georgian and Jimmy Carter was.
Right.
So that was my only other. But I always loved politics. I always just remember having an interest in it. And my family would watch the evening news with Walter Cronkite, and every now and again my dad would let me watch the Brady Bunch instead of the CBS News. But the news was part of our family. And both of my parents loved politics, never got into it, but I always loved it.
Were you involved in campus politics at UGA?
I was at UGA. In fact, I ran for class president and vice president, I think in the 7th grade, and then after that didn't get involved in campus politics till I got here. And then I was vice president and president of my fraternity, which is Theta Chi. I was the administrative vice president and president of the Interfraternity Council.
Mm-hmm.
So that would have been about 92 through, and I was IFC president, I think, right up until the quarter I graduated in 95. So I got involved in campus politics, and some of the folks I got to know then, still friends to this day. And I've always said that everything I learned about politics, I learned on campus, in a fraternity or the IFC. I said, even in Washington, the issues may be different, but the fundamentals are the same. You've got to get a majority of the people to agree to do something in order to move the ball down the field. And that's really where I learned how to do it, was right here on campus.
That's a very long and storied tradition of interfraternity politics and presidents, producing student body presidents. Norman Underwood came out of student politics.
That's right. My predecessors with Senator Isakson, Heath Garrett was student body president.
Mm-hmm.
He was chief of staff. David Schaefer was on IFC.
That's right. Bobby Rowan was student. There's a throwback.
That's exactly. But a lot of people that are involved in politics, and my brother was IFC president,
Sure.
now works for UGA.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it truly was. That's actually how I got to know Senator Isakson. His son, Kevin, although not on IFC, two of his good friends and folks that were his roommates were on IFC with me, Jonathan Tuggle and Stuart Gurr. And so I got to know this guy named Kevin Isakson, and I'd voted for his dad in 1990 when I could first vote. And then, so we got to know him. And so, again, it's just amazing how many folks you get to know.
So were you attracted to business because growing up in a businessman's family, watching your father and his work, is that what drew you to Terry College?
It was. I mean, Terry had a great reputation, and I always loved history, always loved politics, but it seemed like the smart, wise, reasonable thing to do was to go to business school. My dad owned his own company, and figured maybe that would be something that I would do, and again, going to work for Georgia Pacific. And I'm glad I did. It was a good, good kind of training, and it's funny, I joke around, other than Georgia Pacific, it took me almost, 20 years for me to actually use my international business degree as the Commissioner of Economic Development. Right. But that love, I always have loved the free enterprise system. I love business. I loved selling the state. And it really, again, having that foundation through the Terry College was absolutely fantastic. And international business, I always liked that element of it as well, and different cultures and that sort of thing. And so, but yeah, my dad owned his own company. It seemed like the right thing to do.
So what drew you back to school, back to law school after that year or so with Georgia Pacific?
So when I graduated, I had decided I was done with tests and papers. I had sort of an interest in law school at that time, but I was just so kind of burned out. So going to work when I was at Georgia Pacific, and I started interning and volunteering for Senator Isakson's campaign. And I think being in that political world kind of restarted that interest in going to law school. But what I said was I'd just gotten the job in the spring of '95, and I said, all right, if by the fall I still have this interest, then I'll do the process, take the LSAT and that sort of thing. So that was kind of what I did. And in the fall I still had that interest, and so we did, and applied for law school, and it worked out where I could come back to Athens.
What was your specialty that you wanted to study and practice
coming out of law? Well, what's interesting is probably more so it was just the foundation, because I liked politics and I liked government relations. At one time I thought maybe government affairs might be something that I wanted to do, but once I started looking at it, I said, all right, it doesn't matter if you're what field you're in. You could be in social work, you could be a teacher, you could be a business and law. Understanding the law and having kind of that critical thinking is good training. And so we did that. But then I got an opportunity. So the first summer, between first and second year, I interned for Bell South International, which is now part of AT&T.
Right.
But great opportunity on the business side there. Then that summer between second and third year, I clerked at Alston & Bird. And then got the opportunity to go to Alston & Bird, which is a just established, well-known, well-respected Atlanta firm. Just a fantastic group of people and a great opportunity. So I got this opportunity. And what's interesting, though, is because it all kind of comes together, Isakson won a special election for the House seat my third year, the winner of my third year. So
1999.
99. So it was a short 6, 7, 8 week race, helped on that a little bit, and then he wins, And having worked with him before, I mean, this was exciting. And I talked to Heath Garrett, and I said, you know, Heath, I'd love to stay on with Johnny, but Heath, who had also gone to UGA Law School and had practiced at Troutman Sanders, he said, he gave me the best advice ever. He said, Chris, go practice. You can always come back to politics, but you can't go back and try to practice law. You need to start, see if that's for you, and if it is, great. There's other ways you can be involved in politics, but if not, then we can kind of talk. And it was great advice. And so I practiced not very long, it was about 16, 17 months at Alston and Byrd, but I had gotten to know Rogers Wade through Johnny, and that's when the opportunity to go to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation came up. So my interest going it was always policy, it was always politics. There was this kind of underpinning that having a legal education was going to help.
Right.
And it most certainly did, because as you're working on the legislative side of the law, understanding statutory construction and constitutional law and that sort of thing is critically important.
So tell me about getting to know Rogers, getting to work with the Public Policy Foundation. What attracted you to that, and what did you do in that capacity?
Sure. Well, Rogers was one of Johnny's kitchen cabinet guys in the 1996 Senate race, and so I hadn't known him till then. But here I was, the intern and volunteer and that sort of thing, and Rogers just is just such a kind and decent and wonderful guy, and takes all of us under his wing, and he took me under his wing. And then I learned about him being the chief of staff to Senator Talmadge, and I learned about his government affairs work, and then the Georgia Public Policy Foundation, which I had heard of but didn't know a lot about.
Right.
Well, so fast forward then to, so that was 96 when I got to know Rogers, kind of stayed close through the 99 race, but not as close as we became. And then in around 2001, I'm at Alston and Byrd and think, this isn't exactly what I want to do, and I love policy and politics. And I find out Rogers is looking for an education expert. Now, other than having gone to school, I don't think I could say I was an education expert, but I wrote him a letter or an email and explained, I can't remember which, one of the two, it was either email or a letter, but anyway, explained to him why he needed a lawyer. And he and Kelly McCutcheon called me up and said, well, let's go have lunch together. And during the lunch, talked about general counsel and maybe doing some fundraising. They needed somebody to do education, but maybe this other thing. So at the end of the lunch, Rogers looks at me and goes, so what do you think? I said, well, I think it sounds great. He goes, oh, so that means you're going to take the job? I said, oh, I didn't know I was offered a job. So he did, and then I went and worked with them for 2 years and really focused on, so I was general counsel, focused on fundraising, but also got to do charter school work, kind of regulatory stuff, business environment type things. But charter schools were the big thing at that particular time that we spent a lot of time on when I was at the foundation.
So were you involved in crafting the model legislation that became part of the Republican governing agenda?
No, I didn't have anything to do with that, other than we talked about the principles that are the foundation for charter schools. In fact, my recollection is that the law had changed right before I had gotten there, and Roy Barnes had actually been a big supporter of charter schools at that particular time. And then Otis Brumby became the school board chair under Barnes, and he was kind of tasked with kind of moving forward, and Kathy Henson after him, was kind of moving the agenda down the road. And so we ended up working very closely with Governor Barnes' office and with that board to talk about how do you implement this thing that is charter schools. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses, and weaknesses in funding, and weaknesses in transportation, facilities, and that kind of thing. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was it's an interesting concept that to this day, some folks, it's got those that love them and those that don't, and some see them as public schools, which they are, and others don't, and see it as a way to kind of take away from resources. But I was a big fan and supporter, and didn't know a lot about it till I got there. But just had a lot of fun for 2 years really working on it.
So was 1999 your first real campaign experience?
96.
96, excuse me.
96
so the
was
Senate, it'd be the Senate primary, I suppose.
That's exactly. So it was the Isakson, Milner, that, and others. But yeah, so 96 was my first campaign experience.
Okay. So how did you get involved in the 2004 campaign?
So I was working for Rogers, and the Public Policy Foundation's office was in one building in an office park, and the Isakson Congressional office was in another. And I had stayed close From 96 until 99 when I was in law school, and then when Johnny gets elected in 99 to Congress, they asked me to serve as on their, he had a political action committee, so help with that and that kind of thing. So we kind of stayed close with Johnny at that particular time. Well, I go to work for the foundation in 2001, and then in 2003, January of 2003, I get a call from Heath Garrett because Senator Miller, who'd been appointed to Senator Coverdale's position,
Right.
had announced that he was not going to run for re-election and that Johnny was going to. And so actually we were coming back from the Sugar Bowl. Georgia played FSU that year, and we were driving back, and I was on the phone with Heath talking about, he said, hey, I've been Johnny's chief of staff, managed the campaign, but we just started a family. I can't be the campaign manager, but I want to be the consultant. Would you want to come on as the campaign manager? And I said, absolutely, absolutely. So we did that in 03 and 04. So that's how I got and you know, when I was working with Rogers, I'd go in about every day at 4 o'clock, and we talk about Georgia political history, and we talk about, I mean, he told me about this great thing being a Senate chief of staff, and I never thought in a million years I'd ever end up being a Senate chief of staff, but then this opportunity comes up with Johnny running for the Senate, and Rogers was incredibly supportive and said, you have to do it. So we did.
So explain the difference for those listening, what the difference between a consultant and a campaign manager are on a statewide like that.
So in this day and age, the consultant is basically, and it's probably evolved over time. A campaign manager probably was the one that coordinated the media and the fundraising and all that goes on with the campaign. But now there are those that are now kind of experts in campaigning that are the consultant, and there's a number of different varieties of it, but for purposes of this, Heath was the general consultant, meaning he was the one that was shepherding the media folks and the campaign grassroots people and the fundraising and the doing strategy. So that was basically his job, was to be at the middle, so to speak, of the Venn diagram, so kind of just bringing everybody together. As the campaign manager, I was in charge of day-to-day operations of the campaign, in consultation with Heath and all the other consultants that we had. But more the campaign manager now, or at least from when we were working with Johnny, was much more grassroots.
Okay.
It was kind of making sure that we dealt with the grassroots, making sure all 159 counties were organized. You know, I ended up doing a little bit of strategy, but basically it was the grassroots day-to-day managing of getting out the vote, attracting supporters, that kind of thing.
So tell me about that campaign. There was a Republican primary in 04, and it's Senator Isakson, the late Mac Collins was and a little-known businessman named Herman Cain was also somebody who's back in the headlines again. Tell me about running that Republican primary.
Sure.
Go ahead.
It was interesting because Johnny had run twice before. You know, so he was a very popular Republican politician. He'd been in the House and then runs for governor in 1990 against Zell Miller. He goes back to the Senate. He loses the primary, and he loses, obviously, the governor's race. Goes to the Senate, decides to get in the primary against Guy Milner in 1996 and loses that race. And then Democratic Governor Zell Miller puts him on the state school board, which really kept him involved in policy and politics. Then Newt Gingrich steps down in 99, Johnny runs. So that, again, it kind of was the state school board was the bridge to kind of keep him in elective politics. Right. So then Johnny's only been in the House for 4 years when he makes his announcement to run. And it was a little bit controversial. There were some congressmen and others that had been involved, maybe been in office a little bit longer, and you know, maybe thought it was their turn or there needed to be some more conversation. And as I recall, so we were the first ones in 2003, and the way that Republican politics works is that you have county conventions and district conventions and the state convention, which lead up through the spring. So it's February through May, and it was right before the convention of 2003 that we had heard that Herman Cain, who is a businessman, might jump in, and we knew that Matt Collins was looking, and I remember Jack Kingston's name coming up, Lynn Westmoreland at the state level, his name came up as well. But then we started hearing about Herman Cain, and and if I'm not mistaken, he got in before Mac, but I can't quite remember exactly how that was. But it was right around at that particular time, and then so you had two congressmen and this newer person to the scene in politics. And the question was, could Johnny get through a primary? Mm-hmm. Could he get through a primary without a runoff? And I had seen from the '96 race that Johnny maybe took the more moderate position, whereas others took the more conservative position. And so how we kind of managed, that history and then the record that he had in the House was kind of interesting. And, as it related to, and Mac was such a great public servant, and he had had such seniority, as I recall, and well respected and established. But with Herman Cain, you just didn't know kind of where he was going to kind of come from. And he had 2 or 3 issues that were kind of business issues that he was focused on. But one of the issues that really came out between Mac and Johnny that were decisive ended up being the Farm Bill, that Johnny had voted for the Farm Bill, whereas Mac had not. And that Johnny's position on social issues wasn't as moderate as many kind of had remembered, or the way that the '96 campaign had kind of come out. So, but no doubt, as we were getting toward the end of that primary, Herman Cain was kind of on the rise, and Mac was kind of plateauing out. And the question was, were we going to get through without a runoff? And we did. And when we did, it was going to be Johnny's to win. And although we ran against Denise Majette in that general election as well. So, but it was fascinating because from my perspective too. I mean, I just thought the world of Johnny Isakson, and if we had lost that race, that may have been kind of 3 strikes and you're out, and may or may not. But that was kind of the pressure. But to see the respect that he had and to make it through that primary was a pretty amazing thing.
Were you surprised, as in your role as campaign manager, were you surprised that it did not go to a runoff? What had you been anticipating?
We hoped it wouldn't, but we wouldn't have been surprised if it had.
Right.
But as we got through, I mean, I remember looking at polling data that last week or two before the election, and we were bumping just above 50%. I think he ended up with 54. I can't remember exactly where we ended up, but the relief, I mean, the elation when Johnny won that without a runoff was, but it was a testament to, again, his years in service. We put together a good grassroots team. We had a good message. Folks that had been working with him since 1990 were still with him, so they knew Johnny and they knew Georgia, and it was great.
You mentioned that Senator Isakson's opponent in the general election, Denise Majette, didn't turn out to be quite as strong an opponent as earlier Republican office seekers had faced, especially in statewide. You think back to 2002 with Max Cleland and Saxby Chambliss, how tight that race was, and then obviously all the races before that. Why do you think Senator Isakson entered the general election as such a heavy favorite, and turned out to be the case?
Well, I think because for a couple of reasons. One, the state had done this shift, and it was now a Republican majority state. It had been a conservative state. Sure. Now it's a Republican majority state. And so George Bush was in office post 9/11. I think there were some of those factors that were playing into it. Johnny was so well liked. I mean, Johnny to this day appeals to folks that are conservative Democrats, moderates, and Republicans. And so he was a strong candidate. Congresswoman Majette had been in office a very short period of time, and a lot of Republicans had actually come to her to support her in her race against Cynthia McKinney, but maybe not as well known around the state at that particular time as some others. But I think, and it was Johnny's time too. I think kind of there was that sense that he had paid his dues. He'd done it the right way. People liked him, and then the national political scene was also fairly favorable. If I'm not mistaken, I think we had 9 new senators in that class, 7 of which were Republicans. 2 were Democratic, including Senator Barack Obama from Illinois.
That is correct. I wasn't living in Illinois at the time, but I was an Illinois resident at the time. It was my freshman year of college. So you're bringing back all these memories now. I spent my college exile in Missouri. So how much coordination was there with the Bush political operation, which there had been close coordination between the Chambliss campaign and the Bush White House? How much was there with Senator Isakson's campaign?
I don't recall a great deal of coordination. I can say this, though, that Johnny and President Bush had a good relationship. When President Bush first got elected, Johnny's focus in the Congress, because he'd been on the state school board, was education. And so Governor Bush had been big on education, and then comes in, he wants to introduce what became No Child Left Behind. And Johnny had been close to him in that regard. It was an open seat, so that made it somewhat interesting for the national parties. Oftentimes the national parties are very cautious on an open seat race. They'll support heavily the incumbent, but you got to be careful. That being said, I think we had a very good relationship with the folks at the National Republican Senatorial Committee. They understood what Johnny's strengths were and that sort of thing. But it was we had to do what we needed to do to win, but they were certainly saying good things where they could.
Right.
And then separate from that, Johnny's media team, led by Russ Schrieffer, had also been President Bush's team. But going back, so it was, I think the original name of that company was Maverick Media. I think Karl Rove had something to do with it at one time, but it was Stuart Stevens and Russ Schrieffer, and that kind of crowd that knew each other. So they were very well versed, and they were they were experts, and they still are. And Russ helps me with does our media. That just so from that perspective, I mean, I think it built some. Gave Johnny some credibility, so just a good kind of team, that was. I just don't remember a lot of coordinating. I just know there were people that knew one another. So,
and what about the state party, the Georgia Republican Party, working with? Was that a coordinated campaign, or was I guess? Who would have been chair at that time? Would have been
was Ralph at the time?
It might have been Alec.
No, it was Alec. It was Alec Portman.
Around.
Of course it was. It absolutely was. No, it was Alec Portman, and again, Alec and Johnny knew each other for years in the game. But again, parties can do what parties can do, and they've got their role, particularly before a primary's over. It's very dangerous for parties to get involved in it. So no, I don't. Sure, we had our folks that were supporting us that were party members, but not the apparatus. But once we won, they were very, very supportive, and again, it was. I think there was people were coming to really appreciate Johnny Isakson at that time.
So tell me about the transition, Senator Isakson's transitioning from the House to the Senate. You move from Dunwoody up to D.C., so that's a career transition for you. Tell me about that period in those early days.
Absolutely. So probably an easier transition for Johnny, having been up there and really knew a lot of the players in both the House and the Senate. And I think that really benefited him over time as he moves to the Senate, but still had good relationships with John Boehner and others, Eric Cantor and folks in the entire delegation, the Georgia delegation as well. We spent a good bit of that first couple of months in the courtyard in Russell in a trailer as our offices were being renovated. We moved from Dunwoody I remember, so we obviously we went in early November. We go right after Thanksgiving to go look to try to find a place to live. We ended up finding one. We come back, and then shortly after Christmas, maybe early. Or may have been right before Christmas. Anyway, we moved up there, but it was. I remember snowing those first month and a half we were there. There was snow on the ground, which they said is not normal, but it was really cold. But we moved up there and kind of hit the ground running, it was Heath Garrett was the chief of staff, and then we had to blend kind of the congressional office. We blended some Zell Miller folks. We blended in the campaign, and I moved up there as the deputy chief of staff. And so I had to get to know Washington. I had to get to know the Senate. I had to get to know the players. But it was great, and we had, again, some of Zell Miller's folks, which included Joan Kirchner, who now ended up as my wife, and she had been up there as communications director and chief of staff for Zell. So Heath having some congressional experience, Joan having Senate experience, was just a huge help as we kind of transitioned into what we were going to do. But Johnny having such a good relationship too. I don't think the transition from the House to the Senate was as difficult for Johnny. And the two things that matter most to a senator are the ability, to amend legislation and filibuster. So I think Johnny actually felt like he had more of an ability, obviously, which he did, to impact legislation. So I think that was probably exciting for him. I think that was, as a former realtor that understood how you got to bring people together to cut a deal, I think that was very exciting to Johnny Isakson.
So tell me about the transition from deputy chief of staff to chief of staff. How did your role change, and how did you approach that?
So the way Johnny kind of had a flat management kind of network of folks. So having worked very closely with Heath over a long period of time, Heath was actually living in Georgia. And Johnny, that's actually kind of an interesting part of kind of how Johnny has always done it. He liked having the chief of staff, who was only Heath from 1999 until he left in 2007. But in the House, Heath lived at home. So he'd commute back and forth, which was not all that common at that time. It is much more common now, particularly if you live east of the Mississippi. But at that time, it wasn't so much so. So Johnny would have folks that were in charge of the Georgia office and the DC office, and then have a chief of staff that was over the whole kind of team. So he did that in the House and maintained the same thing. So when Heath decided he was going to go back to the private sector and get more involved in kind of the consulting work, we talked about me transitioning back to Georgia and doing the commute, which I did for 5.5 years. So, but Johnny had been good because it was a flat management structure. We all did a lot. So we knew what each other did. We all did a little bit of legislation, and we all were involved in strategy for communications, and we managed the office. And so it got to where fewer and fewer folks from Miller and congressional office and campaign were there, and so there were fewer senior managers. So I would be, it was, Edward Tate ended up being kind of the state director, and general counsel, and Joan was deputy chief of staff and comms director, and I was chief of staff, and we all three kind of ended up managing together. But it allowed me, Joan was based in DC, Edward was based in Georgia, and it allowed me to kind of go back and forth. And so that's how Johnny set that system up, and it was good from my perspective, because I think in order to manage people, you got to be there, and it's hard to be managing on the road, managing from the fly. So to be able to spend a little bit of time. So the way I did it was I flew up every Tuesday morning when we were in session, and I came back on Friday morning. Started off Monday night to Thursday night, but like 15 of the first 18 legs that I did were delayed because of thunderstorms, because it was in the summer. And I told Johnny, I said, Johnny, I'm not going to make it. This is going to be the end of me. And so we decided Tuesday morning to Friday morning, which worked out great. So I ended up doing that for 5.5 years.
So did you get your Delta, Platinum?
Yeah, I didn't get Delta Platinum, but I knew exactly where to go, and Delta was wonderful. They took me to work every week.
So between 2005 and 2007, the Republicans are in the majority.
That's right.
So I guess since for your time on staff, those were the only 2 years Republicans were in the majority.
That's correct.
How did your job or the senator's job or his perspective or approach change from going from majority party to minority party following the 2006 midterms?
Well, I'll answer from my perspective, then my observation of Johnny. So from my perspective, I'm trying to learn about the Senate. I'm new to town. I'm new to the whole institution, and so we were in the majority, and we would, had meetings with the majority leader's office and the whip, and they'd kind of tell us what was going on. So from my perspective, it was those were my two big learning years. I felt like I got a good idea after the first year, but that was a time where I was trying to learn as much as I could. And we thought we were going to be in the majority forever. You know, we thought Karl Rove had talked about
The permanent
generational
Republican
and all that sort of
majority.
stuff. So weren't really thinking. But as we started getting towards 2006, I mean, I can remember we knew we were in trouble and we knew there could be some issues and that sort of thing. And then, you know, you're trying to move the agenda, you're trying to accomplish things, you're trying to bring folks from the other side when you're in the majority in the Senate, and you're trying to convince the House, and you're trying to convince, although it was a Republican majority in the House as well and had a Republican president. But in the Senate, it's all based on 60 votes. It's whether or not you can get 60 votes for anything. So I remember, again, just thinking, wow, you know, it's a challenge to be able to try to do that. I think Johnny understood, you know, the issues coming in. Like I said, I think his transition was not, you know, it wasn't, you know, a huge challenge. But he, too, was trying to learn a little bit of a new job. But by the time it flipped, the good thing about, from my perspective, it's easier to be in the minority because you can just be against things. I mean, that is what it is. It's been that way for a long period of time. So you can talk about what you would do if you were in the majority, but you can criticize.
Right.
So but that's not Johnny Isakson world. In Johnny Isakson world, we're out there to try to continue to work and do good things for the people of Georgia. And he's one of the guys that can get it done. And so as he grew in seniority, now I left in 13, so he's got even more so now. But he could always figure out a way to get it done. You know, one of the first things I remember him working on, and it started when we were in the majority, was the pension plan for the airlines. And it started off with everybody telling him, Johnny, there is no possible way in the world we're doing this thing, the smoothing of the pension plan. 18 months later, he's flying on Air Force One with President Bush, and President Bush calls in his domestic policy advisor who was walking by and said, hey, this is the senator that beat you. So in 18, but that's, I mean, Johnny is just about trying to put together the same thing when it got to when he was in the minority. He could still get things done, and folks that were in the majority would partner with him. And so there is, right below that member level is the chief of staff and legislative director level. And one of the best things that happens in Washington is there is a chief of staff group. So that if the bosses aren't always getting along, there's a pressure valve, and you can still figure out ways to try to get things done. On the flip side, when the bosses are working together, you've got this whole team that could kind of do that. So I just, you know, whenever Johnny was finding ways to try to work on things, that's where we were, and we were developing this network of folks in the Senate as well as chief and deputy chief. And as deputy chief, I got to do a lot because Heath was in Atlanta. So building that network of folks, building that foundation so that we could try to still continue to get things done. So Johnny's the most successful minority member because he can work with anybody, and folks like working with him.
From my perspective, and correct me if you have a different impression, there are two kinds of senators: the ones that are always in front of cameras, sort of want to build a national profile, and then they're the quiet. I don't want to say obscure for lack of a better term, but most Americans outside of their home state might not be able to pick them out of the lineup. It seems that Senator Isakson takes the latter approach, which is the quieter, lower profile. That's probably a better term than obscure, lower profile. Do you think that's his approach, and do you think that's why, in your opinion, he's been as successful as a senator?
Absolutely. And your observation is spot on. There are definitely those in Washington who are always on the Sunday shows. They're always on television. And that plays a role. I mean, there's a purpose for doing that, but Johnny's was not that way. And in fact, there was an article written in the AJC recently by Tamar Hallerman, and Johnny talked about this. And he just said, look, I don't use a lot of words, but when I do, I want them to count. That's number one. And number two, he believed in the reputation, and his reputation mattered. And if he cut a deal, or if he agreed to something, or he agreed to work with you, that was important to him. You know, having been up there during the Tea Party time, a lot of passion, people aren't conservative enough, throw bombs. At times it would be challenging. Johnny would still get things done, but there were folks that were on the far right of the Republican Party that would just get so angry with him and call up and all that sort of stuff. And oftentimes they'd say, we want to see Johnny on Fox News throwing more bombs and going after this, that, or the other thing. And I knew that's just not in Johnny's nature to kind of do that. But one day he was with a group and he said, I was in real estate. And when I first got into this business, if I couldn't find a way to get a willing buyer and a willing seller to the table, where each of them thought they got something and probably gave up a little something, my family didn't eat. And I never sold a house to somebody I trashed. The same thing's true in politics. He said, how in the world can I expect to get things done if I stand on television and trash people and then turn around and need their help? And the light bulb went off for me. I said, oh my goodness, that's what. So he got this from business. I mean, it's his inherent nature, but he also got it from business. That's the only way to get it done. And so I thought that was fascinating. And there's also two other kinds of senators as well. That there's those that have their beliefs and their philosophical underpinnings and don't negotiate, and those that do. And two of the most effective senators that I saw, one on the left and one on the right, was Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy believed what he believed. He was very liberal.
Oh, sure.
But he'd negotiate to get a deal done, and then he'd stand by his word. Tom Coburn from Oklahoma was on the other side. There was Tom Coburn, and he would believe what he believed, passionate conservative. But he'd say, here's what I believe, here's my problem that I have with this piece of legislation, but if you'll work with me to modify it, I can be with you. And he got so much done that way. So I have respect, even though my political philosophy is more like Coburn, but I had respect for both of those men in their approach for how they were U.S. senators.
This is jumping ahead a little bit, but it seems, and your wife is obviously still in the thick of it as chief of staff, it seems that that dynamic, the ability to negotiate, to get to 60 votes, to work with either side, either Democrats, Republicans, Democrats, seems to have eroded even more so since 2012 or 2013 when you left. Is that your perspective?
There is some of that, because I think you could teach a course probably on this in some respects. But I believe that the leaders in the leadership don't want their members to take tough votes anymore.
Right.
So they're kind of standing in the way of legislation getting to the floor that might be controversial. But the second thing is, oftentimes people talk about filibuster reform. My observation from being up there is it's not filibuster reform that's needed. It's actually about the amendments. Because procedurally, what the leader can do is called fill the amendment tree, which means his amendments take, for lack of a better word, but they take precedence. And if he files that amendment, it blocks others from doing that. Well, as I said at the beginning, there's two things that senators have that House members don't: the ability to filibuster and amend. Well, if you don't allow people to amend legislation, they only have one other choice, and that's to filibuster. So I actually see the problems with the filibuster as actually getting away from regular order. It used to be we introduced a bill and it went to a committee and you debated it and you voted on it, and if it made it, got to the floor, and if you voted on it there and it made it, went to the other side and they did the same thing. If there was a disagreement, you had a conference committee and then you hashed it out, it came back, and then if it passed, the president signed it. You don't see conference committees much anymore at all. A lot of legislation is now being done by leadership themselves to make sure that, again, the poison pills or the mines aren't there. And that's both sides. So in my perspective, I don't know that it's, yes, you are, and there's third-party groups that are out there fundraising based on, what these elected officials are doing. And it's harder for them to fundraise if people come together and solve problems. So, but if I can attack you as, oh, you Republican are working with the Democrat, or you Democrat are working with the Republican, it makes it more difficult to get elected and all that sort of. So I think there's these combination of things that have kind of all come together to create a disincentive to work together. But you still have the Johnny Isaksons that are willing to do it, as the chairman of the VA, still getting things done right now, and still the guy that folks want to come to when you have to get something done.
I didn't think when I woke up this morning that we would be talking about procedure or anything like Senate procedure. You've made Professors Tony Madonna and Mike Lynch of the Political Science Department very happy. Talking about regular order.
I'd be happy because again, I think you could kind of teach a whole class on that.
Oh, sure. I believe Tony does.
Probably does, yeah.
But you mentioned regular order, and that was Senator McCain's last high-profile floor speech, was a call to return to regular order. So is that something that you see? How do you return to regular order, move past the current gridlock?
It's a challenge. I mean, I think it's going to be a challenge, but I think if it's that 80% of the senators that don't go on television all the time were to come together in a bipartisan way and just say, hey, this is kind of how Leader A and Leader B, this is how it needs to be. But that's a lot easier said than done. I'm not in any way, and I'm not trying to criticize because it's both sides, but I do think, particularly in the Senate, I mean that's what makes the Senate different. I understand the House is based on the House rules and that sort of. I totally get it, but that's what makes the Senate a little bit different.
So you were up in Washington, or I guess commuting, I suppose, during the 2010 re-elect.
That's right.
Senator Isakson's first re-elect. And you mentioned the Tea Party and the sort of insurgency within the conservative movement. Were you surprised the senator did not have a potent primary challenge in 2010?
We were, and I think again that goes back to it's a testament to who Johnny Isakson was, and on top of that, he had a health scare right before qualifying, which take the kind of times we were in, plus the fact he had a health scare, we were certain that somebody was going to jump in the race, and you heard maybe some rumblings that people were thinking about it, particularly if Johnny's health weren't good and that sort of thing. But it didn't pan out, and so again, I think that was one of the best things that could have happened to Johnny in 2010 was not to get a primary. Not that I think he would have gotten beat, but it just makes it that much more difficult. You got to raise that much more money and that sort of thing. But we could go into the general election, which was President Obama's midterm, and so which was healthcare had just happened in 2009, and then 10 people were whipped up, and so once you got to the general, everybody on the Republican side was generally on the same team, but I thought that was a real benefit to Johnny.
So tell me about leaving Senator Isakson's office for economic development.
So I loved every minute of working with Johnny, and again, he was and always will be one of my heroes, but I was commuting back and forth at a period of time when we weren't doing a lot and we weren't getting a lot done. We're in the minority, and things had kind of started locking down and that sort of thing. And I had a daughter who was back at home. So her mom and I had actually gotten divorced, and shortly after, so I guess it was 2006, and they had moved back to Georgia. So my daughter's back at home, I'm getting on a plane, she's getting older, and that was just getting harder and harder. And Johnny and I actually met for lunch in July of 2013, and I'd asked to meet with him, and I said, Johnny, we've been talking about getting ready for you going into cycle after kind of the next, after 2014 was done. We kind of thinking that we're always thinking ahead, and I said I think we need to be prepared to do that without me as the chief of staff, and it was very uncomfortable for both of us. It was very, very tough, but when I explained to him the reasons why, as Johnny always is, he's just incredibly gracious and kind, and so we kind of talked to, and I said, look, and it needs to be up to you. I'm not around. I don't have to make any, I don't have to live with the decisions that of who you were going to put in which position and all that sort of thing. But I told him, I said, so, but before I went off and started looking for another job, and I think I put as, before I go fishing in anybody else's pond, I want to make sure that you know and you're on board. Well, about that time, a guy that had worked with us and I'd gone to Marist with is Chris Comiskey, who was our state director, and he'd gone to work at UGA, and he'd gone to work for then Speaker Glenn Richardson, and he was Governor Deal's first Commissioner of Economic Development. He called me up and said, hey, I'm probably going to go back to the private sector. I think this would be an interesting job for you. Would you have any interest in it? And I said, well, I think I might. And shortly after that, I got a call from Chris Riley, who not only was Governor Deal's chief of staff, but I'd worked with when he was Congressman Deal's chief of staff. And then he and I were in Leadership Georgia together, and he and his wife and I in 2010. And so I'd gotten to know Chris pretty well. And he called up and he said, "Are you serious about this? You come?" I said, "I am." And he said, "Well, let's talk." So we did, and it worked out. So Governor Deal asked me to come as Commissioner of Economic Development, and it's interesting. I started as Chief of Staff to Johnny Isakson on November the 1st, 2007. I started as Commissioner of Economic Development November
I see where
1st,
this is going.
2013, and Attorney General is November 1st, 2016. So there's something cosmic about that date. So started November the 1st, 2013 as Commissioner of Economic Development.
Something about All Saints Day.
It is, that's right.
So tell me about, you mentioned Chris Comiskey, and I don't want you to put words in his mouth, but describe how the office ran under Comiskey, and then what you took from that,
Sure.
what changes you made, and so on.
Sure, and Chris had a great business background and was very focused on the global commerce piece, which is your traditional business recruitment and existing industry expansion. And Chris was very focused on that and did a great job, I guess, for a variety of reasons, including, that was kind of his personal passion, was to do that. But the department also had trade and tourism and film, and workforce had come over at that particular time, our centers of innovation, Council for the Arts. So you had a lot of different divisions. And just from my perspective, is I wanted to spend time getting to know and working with each of them. So the COO at the time was Pat Wilson, who is now the commissioner. But Pat and I were fraternity brothers, known each other for years, great friends, and just hit it off perfectly. Pat had been doing a lot with the other non-global commerce divisions when Comiskey was there, and knew a lot about it and had great background. And so we kind of just took it where we were going to spend a little bit of time on each. Global commerce is always going to be the cornerstone of economic development, but the other areas also have an impact. And from my perspective, I love seeing how they all interplay in different communities. And while we're trying to get the next Kia, how do we focus on tourism or film? Or if we've got an existing company, how do we take Hartsfield and the ports and our 14 offices around the world, how do we help them become export? So to me, just figuring out that strategic mix was a ton of fun. So that again, and I love film, love the arts, love tourism. So having been a movie buff, the film industry to me was just an incredible opportunity as well.
So I want to talk about film
Sure.
more, but you raise, with recruitment, Kia, for example, how do you balance in that office the needs and wants of those recruits, either international or national from other states,
Sure.
for example, with inducements and everything like that, with the needs of existing companies?
Sure.
That, sometimes people feel like the cable company has a great rate for new customers, but what about the existing customers? In this case, the existing businesses here in
Sure.
Georgia.
Well, and one of the things that we talked about and I learned when I was there is if incentives didn't exist, Georgia would fare very well because of our geography, business climate, logistics network, and that sort of thing. But that just isn't the world that
Right.
we lived in. So you had to be competitive. But it's a state level and it's at the local level. But the thing that a lot of folks don't realize is that Georgia didn't have to offer the same level of incentives as a lot of other places because of everything I just said.
Right.
Great workforce, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two, from a statutory tax credit perspective, because it's all about increasing jobs and investment in the state of Georgia. We're trying to hire more Georgians to do things and
Right.
invest in the state. So no matter who does that, if you hit a certain level, whether you're existing or you're new, you get that tax credit. Now, there are times where you're going to get an incentive for a tax abatement to be new, to come into town and that sort of thing. But it is a balance, and you've got to be careful because it's public and it's out there, and people are going to know what the other person got. The good thing is we kind of have focused as a state on the environment itself so that you don't have to do one-off incentives as much as you are creating an environment where if a company comes here, they know they're going to be successful. But it's like with everything else. It's an art. It's not a science. You got to be able to factor in what part of the state the company is
Right.
going in, what is the industry, how many jobs, what's the average pay? I mean, there's all different kind of factors that you would go into it. And you got to be able to, you have to be able to balance that out.
So this is a tough question, probably not a fair question to ask, but what's the biggest challenge in industrial corporate recruitment that you ran into in your years there? For Georgia specifically.
People ask, oh, is it education or is it transportation?
Right.
We never lost a project when I was there where somebody said it was transportation or it's education. In fact, there's congestion anywhere there's people in the world. And everybody, now that's Georgia, I always used to say, we know that we have congestion in some parts of our state at some times of day or periods of time that need to be addressed. From an education standpoint, we know that there are some schools that have challenges that we got to focus on leadership and provide resources, but we also have some very good schools as well. So let's focus on making sure we do everything we possibly can to raise and lift up the schools that need it, and also make sure the schools are doing the right way can continue to do that. But the biggest thing for us, it usually had something to do with supply chain or customer base. So if you had somebody that was really in the Midwest and we were competing against Nashville, well, sometimes we'd lose out to Nashville because they were closer as far as that goes. But that's when if we lost a project, it was oftentimes because where the customer or where the supply chain was located, not something that Georgia's not doing well.
Right.
It's a very fair question because a lot of people would ask it, and particularly those two issues. But nobody ever came back to me and said, hey, we would have done. In fact, I'll say when we were recruiting GE, they said that during their process that they had an impression about congestion in Atlanta, but having been on the ground and seeing what Georgia's done, passing the transportation bill that was going to increase $1 billion worth of new dollars into the system, they said, you guys are ahead of the game. Most states and cities talk about their problems.
Right.
They talk about congestion, but Georgia has a plan. It's executing on the plan, and it's funded the plan. So I think it will be, over time, it's going to be good.
So the film industry is probably what most people inside and outside of Georgia think of when they think of the new economic development, at least the recent economic development in Georgia. Tell me about the film industry, where it was when you came onto the job and where it was when you left in 2016.
Well, I think you probably have to even go back farther. Everybody remembers that, Georgia would have a few films filmed here, Smokey and the Bandit, Deliverance, Sharky's Machine, a couple of those kind of early on in the 70s or early 80s. But in 2007, under the Perdue administration, Georgia passed its first tax credit. And at that time, the industry was about a $250 million a year industry. Fast forward during the Deal administration, they enhanced the credit, did a few other things prior to me getting there in 2013. But really the commitment, investing in a film academy, which was one of the first joint ventures between the university system and technical colleges to shore up crew and the crew base that we have and that sort of thing. Focusing on the customer service that the film office provided, having a good incentive, continuing to have good relationships with the industry. We went, I think it was about $7 billion a year industry when we left in 16, and now it's about a $9 billion a year industry, about 450 shows. And I think when I left, it was about 250 or 275 films and television shows filmed in Georgia, but it's now up to like 450. So it's an industry like automotive or aerospace or that's how it hires Georgians to do things. And because Louisiana had a budget crisis and they let their program go by the wayside, North Carolina had a political issue in the 2014 elections, let that credit go. We got a crew base. And that was the biggest challenge that we had is we only had enough crew for so many shows.
Right.
Well, when that happened, then you start having Marvel come, and you had all these big, you had the studio saying, "Hey, go to Georgia. You want to break into the business, go there." And so now we have, and having television shows 9 months a year, that's critically important to keeping crew as well. So we're just maturing as an industry.
I think one of the questions when inducements or incentives, tax credits are involved, there's a concern among some that it could be a race to the bottom, trying to give away the farm to build and grow an industry. How do you guard against that while also maintaining an incentive that draws and attracts
Sure.
and keeps
Well,
industry here.
And I think part of that is the legislative process and the process of people being involved in oversight and that sort of thing. You know, we have at this time we have a 20% tax credit, and then you get 10% if you market the state.
Right.
So it's in essence a 30% tax credit over $500,000 spent. But the difference for us and other states, it's actually a transferable tax credit. So those studios can get the money quickly, and because we've had great leadership in the governor's office and at revenue. In fact, the studios love Georgia's revenue department because we audit and we do things quickly so they can have access to that cash. And then when you see the number, because each show has to fill out the form, how many hotel nights they used and purchases and that sort of thing, there's a way you can go in there and actually look at it and make sure. And when you hear Cofer Brothers would have gone under in 2008 but for the industry. When you look at Sonoy, Georgia, which would have had maybe 2 or 3 cars downtown at one time, would have 25 or 27 different states because of The Walking Dead coming.
Right.
There's a lot of anecdotal out there, and you know, people can quibble over what the multiplier should be. Should it be 3? Should it be 4? Should it be 8? Whatever it may be. But the long and the short of it is, when you see those little yellow signs around the state of Georgia and you know people are there spending money, the multiplier effect is important, and it's great for the economy in the state of Georgia.
So 2016 rolls around, and your name appears once Attorney General Sam Olens announces that he's stepping down. Tell me about that process and when you decided. Were you approached? Did you approach? Walk me through that and how you became Attorney General.
Sure. It's we first started, reading in the paper in around January that there may be this transition at Kennesaw that might include my predecessor Sam Olens, and so there was a little flurry there at that time. No conversations with me or anybody that I was aware of, but then it kind of died out until the summer, and I'd say probably July-ish. And then it kind of picked back up again. And I had people ask me if I was interested, and I would say if the governor thought that I could do this job, and then I most certainly would be open to doing it. But it was kind of intermediaries, and then it started getting in the paper, and folks would start talking and all that sort of stuff. And I had one conversation one time, and it was probably in August. I don't remember exactly, but so August of 2016, where Chris Riley called me and said, "Hey, I know there's a lot going on, a lot of moving parts, but just wanted to tell you where we are, what our thought process is." And he said, if this were to happen, would you have any interest in it? And I said, same thing. I said, I would if y'all thought that I could could help the state, something to that effect. And then fast forward to, I guess it was probably mid-September or the end of September, and it really kind of ginned up because I think Sam would either have been appointed or there was a lot of kind of conversation there. And it's kind of a funny story because the only reason I knew that I was going to get the job is because Chris Riley called Pat Wilson to come down and talk about taking over economic development. And Pat called me and said, "Hey, just want you to know I'm going down there." I said, "Okay, well, let me know how it goes." And so he did. He called me and said, "Well, they offered the position." And so later that afternoon, I remember I was out in the backyard, and I called up Chris Riley, and I said, "Well, hey, man, appreciate the opportunity." He goes, "You're going to do great. You're going to do great," because he was out doing something on the farm. And the next day, we had an economic development announcement or something, so we happened to be in the back of the governor's office, and the governor was there, and I said, "Well, Governor, thank you for your confidence." He goes, "You're going to do great. You're going to do great." But to this moment, I don't believe they ever actually said, "Would you like to do this?" We kind of went along with it, and it worked out so well, and I'm just having been able to work with Johnny Isakson and Nathan Deal, and their approach being so similar. Right. Don't chase television cameras, get the job done. It was two incredible individuals to work with that closely to see, and who have that much respect from such a wide range of political folks. So to have the governor have that kind of confidence in me, but it is kind of a funny story that I found out from Pat before I heard from.
It was nice of them to give you the job since they had clearly found somebody else for your current job.
I was hoping.
You were out of work.
That's right, one way or the other. That's right.
So tell me about how you found the Attorney General's office when you arrived, your goal setting, and moving forward from there.
Well, I had known Mike Bowers a little bit because of Johnny Isakson. I knew Thurbert Baker a little bit because of Johnny Isakson, but I knew Sam really well because he'd been Cobb County Commissioner and Commission Chair, and then through his time as AG, and he was a personal friend. Knew about the institution that was the law department, and what I found is just an incredibly dedicated. We have 150 lawyers, about 150 professionals that are investigators or auditors or IT folks, and they love the public service element of it, and they are not in and of themselves political. And I've really found them to be, here's what the law is. If the law needs to change, you go across the street and somebody else changes it, but our job is just to say, here's what it is. And I appreciate that. One person has to run for office to lead the department, but that's where the politics begins and it ends with the Attorney General. And really seeing the duty, we talk about this, but defend the Constitution of the United States, constitutional laws of the state of Georgia, but represent the interests of the people of Georgia. And that piece really is where the folks at the department they really take great pride in saying, we're the defenders of the laws of the state, the reputation of the state, the interests of the state. It's a pretty awesome thing to join that group of folks that feels that way.
You sort of laid out, what the constitutional responsibilities of your office are. What are the priorities that you've set for your office?
Sure.
Issues that are perhaps current issues, threats to the state, threats to the interest of Georgians?
Yep. Well, I'll answer the kind of three different buckets, but one, we're the lawyers for the executive branch of state government. So any of the agencies, boards, and the authorities that comprise state government, we are the lawyers for. We don't represent the legislative branch, but we work with them. We don't represent the judicial, but we will represent judges as a courtesy, which I think is critically important. But that's not the priority or primary focus of the law department. It's the executive branch. So day to day, providing excellent legal representation for them. So we talk about there's that day to day providing good legal work, but truly it's excellence in work product, customer service, and communications as we do that. But there's always going to be issues that the office is going to take on, and we've got several that we focused on: human trafficking, opioid abuse, elder abuse, cyber crimes, gangs, openness and transparency in government, and a good business environment, because again, that's part of the interest of the people of the state. So those kind of 7 different areas are where we've spent a good bit of our time, in addition to providing good day-to-day legal representation for the executive branch.
So tell me about your first time running, campaigning as a candidate yourself. How different is it from being a campaign manager, chief of staff, to actually running statewide yourself? It's
surreal. It really is surreal. Again, I feel fortunate because I've, managed one campaign. I was chief of staff on another campaign, and I was kind of unofficial advisor on the third statewide for Johnny, and saw Governor Deal run. And I've said going from chief of staff, which was kind of one seat over from the member with one set of kind of responsibilities and duties, to commissioner next to the governor. The governor called the plays, and we ran them, but you had a certain amount of autonomy there.
Right. To
moving to Attorney General, where it's you. It all comes down to you. It doesn't seem to be as a big geographic move, but it kind of is. It really, at the end of the day, but it's something that I was excited about and I love. We were trying to learn what the office, the functions of the office while running at the same time, which is a little bit unique and not quite the way that usually you run for office, If you win, you have a period of time to do that job before you run again. Well, we were kind of running parallel tracks. It's a big state. Johnny used to tell us, just remember when you're scheduling, there's 45 of y'all, there's one of me. You get to hand me off to other people, but I got to go to everything. And I called him up not long after taking this job. I said, I now totally understand, and I'd like to apologize for anything I did. But it comes down to, it's on you. You wake up every day and you see what the schedule's going to be, and you get around the state because everybody wants to look you in the eye and shake your hand. Mm-hmm. It's a relational business. Doesn't matter how much social media there is or television, was, and always will be a relationship business. People are attacking you. You got to be prepared for that. Your family's got to be prepared for that. But you also get a chance to get out there and see a great state and get to meet a lot of good folks. And so it's energizing when you have people, when you're out there. I loved playing sports when I was a kid. There's that adrenaline rush from playing. Same kind of thing when you're campaigning. It's a little bit of a comparison there. We're fortunate that we won, and we've now been through the ringer. We weren't just an appointed attorney general. We've gone through. We ran for 2 years in an interesting environment, and we prevailed. So that feels pretty good.
Does I suppose not the approach, but being elected in your own right, do you feel that has given you more of a mandate to pursue certain issues or that perhaps you wouldn't have had you simply been an appointed attorney general between 16 and 18?
I don't. Maybe mandate's the right word. It also gives you the confidence to know that what we talked about and the agenda and the record that we developed over a short period of time, people thought were, good for Georgia. I also think, though, that after 2 years, now I'm 2.5 years in, or not quite, but I feel like I can add value because I know the issues, I know the process, I know what the job entails. You got a good team, we work together. And so, and I also, having worked with Johnny Isakson and Nathan Deal, having seen all the federal issues you got to deal with, talking about business issues, I have a pretty good idea of, I feel like, that what Georgians are interested in and how they view what they want our state to be. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the issues that we're dealing with federally and from a state perspective, we've dealt with before in some form or fashion. Some are new, but I feel like, since 2000 and the end of 2004 or 2003 during the campaign, we've been talking a lot about these issues. Mm-hmm. But I think it's more of a confidence and than it is a mandate. I think mandate can be negatively construed, and I almost look at it. There's more of a. I'm very sensitive to and aware of the authority that's been given to me by the people of the state to hold this office for a period of time for them, and I truly mean that. It's like with openness and transparency in government. I'm very aware, and I'm very focused on making sure that people know that's their documents. It's not the government's. And so I have this philosophy about that. It's kind of an awesome responsibility.
So we're looking ahead as we sort of wrap up this interview, and you've mentioned it a few times. What do you think the legacy of a Senator Isakson and a Senator Deal are, and do you think that perhaps their model, their approach to politics is less and less valued in the current political environment we find ourselves in?
I think their legacy is actually going to be very similar, and I think their approach is actually appreciated more, not less. The problem is there's a lot of people that go the other route, but it took them a long time in public service to earn the trust of people so that they could do that. Now, I think it's civility. I think they are great examples of you can either be constructive or destructive in politics. And they chose constructive. They're the ones they both love to identify problems and solve those problems rather than chasing the television camera. I think that's very, very similar. And I do think that, when you talk with folks that are involved in elective office that are, Republicans, Democrats too, they appreciate how those two gentlemen went about their business. And I think it is a great example. And we all talk more and more right now in 2019 about civility. There's two great examples of civility.
I was speaking to your predecessor, Sam Owens. Actually, he was the previous interview that I did, and he voiced his concerns that the Attorney General's position, not necessarily here in Georgia, but nationwide, had become or was becoming too politicized. That was a deep concern of his. Is that something that you are on guard against or constantly aware of? One, that perception, and then two, perhaps guarding against it?
Oh, absolutely. And, I think that, again, the primary job is to take the laws that are passed by the legislature and signed by the governor and then enforce those laws with the executive branch. There's no doubt that attorneys general have not, that the position and those that have run have fallen into the, I think same pull that everybody else has, which is pull towards the polls. And there's a lot of folks that are attorney general that want to run for Senate or they want to run for governor. And so there can be some political agenda. I do think, however, it's dangerous when you weaponize or politicize the attorney general's office, where you can't get something done legislatively or through the legislative process, so you turn to the state through the attorney general and say, hey, you go after X, Y, or Z. Obviously, if we're talking about somebody that, that's the important principle, And I'm not talking about prosecuting a human trafficker versus not.
Right.
But I'm talking about from how do we establish this framework of laws that the people have spoken on through their representatives, and then take it from there. But you do see folks that will. You'll see it in business cases where there may be something that is technically legal, but some have decided they don't prefer it to be done that way or think it should be done elsewhere. And so I think in the context of consumer protection, which is a good thing, I do think sometimes, though, there are those that are attorneys general that will take the power of the state and go after an unpopular product or an unpopular company or whatever that, and I think that starts getting to be a dangerous game. So yeah, you do see it. I'm constantly aware of it, and again, I think my job is to uphold the laws of the state of Georgia. But there are always going to be issues that you want to deal with, and some may say that politicizes it. Well, I think human trafficking and addiction and elder abuse yet to meet the person that is for any of those things. We've tried to find bipartisan or nonpartisan issues that we can rally around: openness and transparency in government, cyber crimes, gangs, those types of things where we can bring a lot of folks to the table. And then how we do it, hopefully, is the right way.
Well, just before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add for posterity's sake, I suppose?
No, I'm just glad that my alma mater is doing this great program, and glad you're doing this.
Well, I appreciate that, and on behalf of the Russell Library and the University of Georgia, thank you very much, Attorney General Chris Carr, for taking some time this afternoon.
Thanks, Ashton.
Really do appreciate it.
Appreciate you.